Hello everybody, happy Tuesday and welcome to another episode of this. Okay, we're back and you know what? I've got a request that I'm going to fulfill. I'm going to do half of it this week, half of it next week. Watcher Haunted Ghost asked me to talk about real vampire and werewolf stories. So I'm going to do that. I thought this was a great thing to kind of look into. And I remembered while reading this comment a story that I had forgotten about a long time ago, and I'm going to get to talk about it today, and I'm kind of excited. So thank you, Haunted Ghost, for the request. We're going to talk about vampires today, and we'll talk about werewolves next week. So to begin, when it talks to about reading material for vampires, there's a whole bunch of, especially stuff that's been put out recently. I'm going to talk about a kind of a underground true crime-ish kind of book that was published in 1998 later. But for now, when we're talking about kind of vampire history, I have a book here it's just called The Vampire Book. And it's called The Encyclopedia of the Undead by J. Gordon Melton. I'll write this all down in the description below, so if you want to look into it. I have used this book a lot. This has been a well-loved, researched book. And it's like an encyclopedia. It talks about vampires both in history and in pop culture. And what I want to talk about from this book today is kind of after this book takes a while to get started. So what we have is we have a foreword, and then we have the foreword's really long, and then we have a preface, and then we have an introduction. So there's a lot of pre-writing that goes into this. And if you've ever listened to A Case for Classics, my podcast, I talk about how much I love Penguin Classics versions of some of these pieces of classical literature that I talk about because of the forewords and the introductions that you get from scholars writing about this piece. So there's a lot of really interesting openers to this book before we get to it. But the first part of this book is a chronology of vampires in history as far back as we can get. So I want to run through some of it. Probably I can get through all of it. It stops at 1997 because this is an older book. This is the second edition, I think it says somewhere. Yep, the second edition. So it might be up to further editions by now. I should look into that actually. But starting off, the first entry into this chronology is prehistory. Vampire beliefs and myths emerge in cultures around the world. And then in 1047 AD, I'm assuming, first appearance in written form of the word upir, an early form of the word later to become vampire, in a document referring to a Russian prince as Upirlichi, or wicked vampire. And then 1190, Walter Map's De Nagis Curialum includes accounts of vampire-like beings in England. 1196, William of Newburgh's Chronicles records several stories of vampire-like revenants in England. And then there's a whole bunch of entries that take place in the 1400s, and it's all about our Wallachian Prince Vlad. And that all goes on until that ends in 1477 when he is assassinated. 1560, Elizabeth Bathory is born, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on. 1614, Bathory dies. Leo Alladius finishes writing the first modern treatment of vampires. That's in 1645. 1657, a friar writes a book that links vampirism and witchcraft. 1672, a wave of vampire hysteria sweeps through Istra. A German vampire text by Philip Rohr is written in 1679. 1710, vampire hysteria sweeps through East Prussia. 1725, 15 years later, vampire hysteria returns to East Prussia. 1725 through 1730, vampire hysteria lingers in Hungary. A lot of vampire hysteria going through sort of Eastern Europe here. The wave of vampire hysteria in Austria and Serbia produces the famous cases of Peter Plagojewicz and Arnold Paul in 1725 and 1732. 1734, the word vampire enters the English language in translations of German accounts of the European waves of vampire hysteria. So the first written form of the word vampire is in 1047. 700 years later, it enters the English language kind of formally, I guess. And then, we get more church guys talking about vampires. Treatise on Vampires, vampire poem Der Vampir, published by Heinrich August Ossenfelder in 1748. Vampire Hysteria, Vampire Hysteria, Vampire Hysteria. 1797, Goethe's Bride of Corinth, a poem concerning a vampire, is published in 1797. Considering that Dracula is published in 1897, I think. I mean, that's 100 years before Dracula is published. Way to go, Goethe. If you don't know, Johann von Goethe wrote Faust. Samuel Taylor Coleridge writes Christabel, now conceded to be the first vampire poem in English. I Vampiri is an opera, opens in Milan, Italy. We've got more poems. Reports of sheep being killed by having their jugular veins cut and their blood drained circulate through modern England. The Vampire by John Stagg, an early vampire poem, is published. Byron wrote a poem about vampires. 1819, John Polidori's The Vampire, the first vampire story in English, is published in the April issue of New Monthly magazine. John Keats composes The Lamia, a poem built on ancient Greek legends. Lord Ruthven, which, isn't Lord Ruthven the name of the vampire from Polidori's story? I don't know. Some of these, it's a lot of blah blah. So we're in 1829, another story. Bram Stoker is born 1847. Alexandre Dumas' last dramatic work, Le Vampire, opens in Paris in 1851. So we're going to get a lot of blah, blah, blah. So Carmilla, finally, 1872, written by Sheridan Le Fanu, comes out. Carmilla is one of those, it's probably maybe one of the first actual modern vampire stories. If you've never read it, it's fantastic. And then, we get more, there's some reports in Ireland of fishy things going on. H.G. Wells wrote a story, and then Dracula comes out. The Vampire by Rudyard Kipling. And we're in 1912 by this point. 1913, Dracula's Guest by Stoker. 1920, Dracula, the first film. We get Nosferatu. And then it's a lot of more books. And then we're in movie territory now. So we're getting a lot of movie stuff. It's all movies. Why did they put Plan 9 from Outer Space on this list? I'm trying to spare you here. So it's all movies from here on out. And then the very last, 1994, the film version of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire opens with Tom Cruise as the Vampire Lestat and Brad Pitt as Lewis. And I think we can probably point to that movie being released and the resurgence of that book as sort of what spurred on the vampire movement, the underground vampire movement. I need to point that out because that will be part of one of these stories, these true stories. Members of a vampire cult led by Rod Farrell are arrested for the murder of 2 people in Florida. They were subsequently tried and convicted of 2 murders. That was based on sort of a LARPing game called Masquerade. Do you remember that story? It's a true crime story. Older guy, not older, but he's like 18 and his girlfriend was really like illegally young. And they wanted to run away together, but her parents wouldn't let them, so they killed her parents. I mean, it doesn't have much to do with vampires and more to do with controlling boyfriends. 1997 is the last entry here, and it's the centennial of the publication of Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula. So yeah, this will be in the comments. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. A lot of really beautiful, like, set pictures from movies. But it's an interesting read, if nothing else. So, let's actually talk about some true vampire stories. Now, the first one can be chalked up to ignorance concerning tuberculosis. And the second one, it's much more modern than you might think. And there's a whole lot of mystery surrounding it. Now, the second one is alive and well on the internet. This is something, there's a Reddit dedicated to it. By all means, visit it. The first one is well known as a vampire story. If you've never heard of it, I'm going to assume you haven't, but if you have, please don't think I'm talking down to you or like trying to explain cornflakes to you or anything. It's just you wanted real, so we're going to talk real. So the first case I want to talk about is about Mercy Brown. Mercy Brown was a girl who lived in Exeter, Rhode Island in the latter part of the 1890s. So she died. The story has to begin with Mercy Brown dying. She died in 1892. Now, what was going on in Exeter, Rhode Island was there was a wave of tuberculosis going through the town. And what they called it back then, they called it consumption. So if you hear people saying they died of consumption, it's tuberculosis. And if you really think about it, 1892 wasn't that long ago. But what's astounding is, as virulent and as devastating as tuberculosis could be, it took a very long time to gain an understanding of it. So this was sweeping through all of New England. There was just a very bad tuberculosis pandemic going on. And it happened in Exeter, Rhode Island, to sort of settle on this particular family of the Browns. And it started with the matriarch. Her name was Mary Eliza. She died first. And then their eldest daughter, Mary Olive. She died next. And then daughter Mercy died. And then their youngest son, his name was Edwin. He became sick. Now, we look at this today and we see tuberculosis is highly contagious. That's what's going on. You know, that it's sweeping through this household and it's killing people. Also, tuberculosis is horrible. I've covered stories on A Case for Classics about authors who had tuberculosis for years before it finally killed them. But to have it even do it quickly, it's a devastating disease. It was miserable. The people who died suffering. So the thing is they didn't know much about it back then. And what was the superstition or the belief? Maybe it's not fair to call it a superstition, but the belief back then was that if many members of a certain family or household just started dying, then there was the suspicion that there was a vampire among them. They didn't use the word vampire. They had more delicate words that kind of danced around it. But the word vampire obviously in 1892 did exist. John Polidori and Sheridan Le Fanu had been talking about it. But in New England, which is a superstitious place, especially then, they didn't use the word vampire. But that's what they were talking about. This wasn't some sort of lich or shade that they were talking about going through the family. So what they did was when Edwin became sick, after these three women in the family had died, the neighbors kind of started, oh, it looks like they got, that problem. They've got the, the risen problem going on. So they talked to the patriarch, his name was George Brown, into exhuming the three bodies of his dead family members. We're going to play it safe. We just want to look. We just want to look and make sure that it is consumption and nothing else that's, currently plaguing young Edwin. And if it is something else, we might be able to save Edwin. So let's look. And because of this promise of possibly being able to save Edwin and not lose his whole family to this disease, he concedes. And they exhume these three bodies. Now, Mary Eliza and Mary Olive, who at this point had been dead a couple years, they were normally decomposed. Everything was, par for the course. They were rotten, they were desiccated, all was normal. However, Mercy was still rosy and pink. There was blood coming out of her mouth, and when they opened her up, there was still blood in her heart, which, what's that mean? Does blood leave the heart when you die? Like, they weren't doing big time embalming that back then. You were put in a box and buried. So I don't quite know what that means, but so modern science says that after Mercy had died, she died in the winter. And after she died, they stored her body for a couple of weeks in an icy cold mausoleum. And they believe that did a sort of part in maybe not embalming her, but just kind of slowing down the process of decomposition on her. I'm not exactly sure how long she had been dead at this point, but it was long enough to have expected a decent amount of decomposition. And the fact that there was close to none was enough to alarm these people. And they were like, okay, that's it. This is the person who's making Edwin sick. You can see from the blood in her mouth, they were convinced Mercy Brown was a vampire. So what they did was they took out her heart and her liver and they burned them until they were ash, and they used this ash to make a sort of tonic. They mixed it with some sources say it was water and some sources say it was communion wine. Either way, they mixed it with some sort of liquid to make a healing tonic for Edwin and to drink it. And if he drank this would mean, first of all, Mercy would stay in the ground. She has no heart. That's it. She's gone. But it would also undo what Mercy had supposedly already done to him. So they give him the tonic, and the poor kid ends up dying. He makes it maybe 2 months before he ends up dying too. Which is, it's very sad. Tuberculosis is terrible, and it went through and it ravaged this poor single family. There were almost no Browns left. George probably remarried. I didn't look into it. It's actually kind of hard to find just because it's one of those things where so many people already know about it that so many things are kind of assumed that but it doesn't, that's 4 people from a single family that died. I feel terrible for George Brown. He lost his whole family. Now remember, this all happened in 1892. In 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula, and even though that's 5 years later, Dracula had been in the works for a while by the time this happened, and he would have very much known about this. This would have made the papers, even in England. He worked for a newspaper for a time in England. He would have absolutely known about Mercy Brown. And it is believed that the character of Lucy Westenra from the story Dracula is based loosely on Mercy Brown, and the way they end up kind of putting her down after she contracts vampirism is based on what they did to Mercy Brown's body, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, Bram Stoker had many influences for Dracula, and Mercy Brown is but one of them. He didn't write the whole book based on this. Dracula had been in the works for a very long time before it came out. The second story I want to talk about takes place in 1996. I want to talk about Susan Walsh. Now, when she disappeared, and that's it, we don't have a body, we don't have confirmation of death. Susan Walsh was 36 years old on July 16th, 1996, when she leaves her 12-year-old son in the care of his father. And she says, I'm going to be right back. Now, the setting of this, it's in Nutley, New Jersey. Nutley, New Jersey is just outside New York City. She lived in an apartment building, in the apartment just above her ex-husband, and they kind of shared custody of their son. And she didn't have a phone in her apartment, and she, took the kid to her ex-husband's, and said, here, watch the kid for a minute. I'm going to run across the street and make a phone call at the payphone. And she left everything in her apartment. We're going to get a little true crimey here, because that's why this case kind of lives on the internet. But she left everything in her apartment. No personal effects were taken. Her wallet was still there. There's some talk about a missing frying pan, but you're going to have to go down the Reddit hole for all of that. I'm just going to give you the high points, and you can run with it after that. What the authorities eventually come to the conclusion of is that she disappeared on her own. But there is a problem with this, because she was a doting mother to her only child. She had some personal problems, but she didn't take anything. She didn't take anything with her. She was going to run across the street to make this phone call, and she just never came back. She was going to be back in just a couple minutes to get her kid from the ex-husband, and she just never came back. So the backstory is Susan Walsh is a woman. She's always dreamed of being a writer, and she particularly loves being an investigative journalist. She's, for the most part, freelance. She does a lot of writing for the New York publication, The Village Voice, which, good for you, girl. But she has a history that sometimes is behind her and sometimes isn't. So in the 80s, she was going to college, and to help pay for that, she worked in a strip club. She was an exotic dancer. And this became, it was more than a job for her. It became a sort of lifestyle that she got sucked into. And it sounds like it was involuntarily that she got sucked into, and she became, she was addicted to drugs. She was an alcoholic, and that's really sad, but she did eventually, it seems, get out of it. She was able to quit drinking, she was able to quit drugs, and she graduated college. And she cleans up, she gets married, she has her kid, but her marriage starts falling apart eventually. And in order to take care of herself and her child, she returns to dancing. And through that, she's in Nutley again, and she's in the New York scene, and she's in the New York club scene, and she's able to use, these connections that she's making being in the club scene as a dancer to sort of get her foot in the door about certain underground ways of life. Now, it depends on what sources you read about Susan, but she didn't enjoy being a dancer. She didn't enjoy the clientele. She didn't enjoy the life that it was. And we don't judge here. I know some people, dancers, it's a job, and it's an enjoyable job, and they do their thing and they make their money, and good for them. They do it in heels that I would die if I tried to walk in them. So we don't judge, but in this particular case, it was a problem for her. But she was able to parlay this into connections, into being able to have touch points, and able to roll this into this investigative journalism thing. So she goes back to school, graduate school, for journalistic writing. I can't remember what exactly it was called, but it's at like New York State University. She's in graduate school. She's dancing to help pay for that, but she's also writing. And she writes a piece for the Village Voice on sort of Russian mafia underground things, where the mafia is kind of trading in flesh, where they're sort of forcing women to dance, forcing women to take the stage. And she writes this piece, and it blows up. And she becomes paranoid because she starts worrying that, she wrote a piece on an organized crime syndicate. She has a target on her back now, at least as far as she's concerned. And her next piece for the Village Voice concerns, we're moving to a different club scene in New York, but every bit as underground, the vampire club scene. And this is, again, early mid-90s. This is very much in line with the sort of gothic resurgence, the Anne Rice people, and people LARPing as vampires, essentially. And she is able to get into it. She actually starts dating a quote-unquote vampire. And the piece that she writes for the Village Voice ultimately gets rejected because they found it to be too sympathetic and biased of a piece for them to publish. And this is when things kind of start, people around her are noticing, things are bad. She, was dating this vampire guy. They break up. She has a lot of ex-boyfriends in her past, which, again, no judgment. You do you, girl. But one of them she has a restraining order against, and she starts showing up to work, with bandages on her wrists, and she's seemingly paranoid, and she tells people, I think I have a stalker. And she's really still kind of married to this vampire story. She really wants to get it out there. She's kind of pissed off that they didn't publish it, while also still being kind of paranoid about this Russian crime syndicate story she did. Things are going bad for Susan Walsh, is what I'm trying to say. Now, the problem is we've got lots of sources. We've got a lot of hearsay. There's a lot of things being thrown out and said that can't necessarily be substantiated easily for a quick YouTube video, for instance. So there are some that say she was bipolar and she wasn't medicated for it. There are others that say she took Xanax for a high and that it wasn't something that she needed. And I don't know how those two, they absolutely can exist in the same world, that they can be at the same time, but the way that it was written out was messy. So it looks like she was getting back into, you know, the lifestyle of the dancing, which was how she was paying her bills. And there were, you know, some close to her said, yeah, she was doing drugs again. Yeah, she was doing weird stuff. But there was also some personal things that she wasn't talking about with the people close to her. Like, again, the bandages, and she was getting very pale, and she was looking very sickly, and she was being very paranoid. So, one story is that she was still working on this vampire story. And from her point of view, these are just people who are sort of cosplaying as vampires, and it's a club scene, and it's sometimes a sexual thing, sometimes a lifestyle thing, where there's consensual blood play going on. There's consensual things going on between these people. However, there are some within this community that say, but there are dotted among us in this underground group real vampires, like actual vampires, not people drinking blood, but real immortal, monstrous vampires. So you have to be careful. And this could just be part of the mythology. I mean, that's what makes it sexy, right? The danger is sexy. But part of her story and the research for the story that she really wanted to get put out was to try to get in touch with one of these real vampires. And she was able to get a source who said, I can get you in touch with one of these real vampires. I can get you, you know, he may not want to do an interview, but I can certainly get you in touch with them. And the mythology now is that she was able to get a name, and a meeting was set up, and she was just never seen again. Then the vampires got her. And there's a whole bunch of what ifs. There's a whole bunch of maybes. Her brother has been seen as a sketchy character. Her ex-husband, oddly, has not. He was, you know, looked at, as is par for the course, but he was ultimately cleared of any sort of suspicion. But her brother looks to be kind of a sticky character. The Russian mob seems to be kind of something to look into, and this Vampire Underground thing. Now, in 1998, a book called Piercing the Darkness, Undercover with Vampires in America Today by a woman named Katherine Ramsland. Now, Katherine Ramsland got word of what Susan Walsh was trying to do with these underground vampire clubs. So she kind of took up the mantle and started looking into it too. And she ultimately was able to kind of clear the vampire people as mostly harmless, despite the Rod Ferrell stuff and the every once in a while there's an outlier who takes it too far. By and large, these were people who were living a secret life in an underground kind of way. And they were not interested in hurting people. Everything that they did, they were very careful to make sure it was consensual. And this book sort of covers these people who, by and large, are harmless. What they do is consensual, and what they do is they're just pretending. They might not agree. They might not like that wording, but this is what Katherine Ramsland came up with. And she basically wrote the story in book form that Susan Walsh wished she had written. But if you want to, I'll put this all below the name of the book, but if you want to look into this and about what people think, what people like to theorize happened to Susan Walsh, there's a Reddit based on it. There's all kinds of websites. Unsolved Mysteries did an episode on her. The Show Disappeared did an episode on her. Now, those will tend to kind of shy away from the vampire aspect, and there are some websites that want to talk a little more about the vampire aspect. It looks in reality to have been somewhere in the middle. Like some places, like Unsolved Mysteries, they didn't want to talk about it at all. They didn't want to talk about the vampirism, about the possibility that someone set up a meeting with her and used it as an opportunity to do something to her under the guise of being a vampire, which is an interesting angle that should be looked at. And some people want to say, of course, she found a real vampire and the vampire got her. But this is a real vampire story. Susan Walsh. Again, this will all be down below in the description so you can look it up yourself. Again, this story is alive and well on the internet. People are still talking about it to this day. I don't know when the last Reddit post was on it. This one was from 3 years ago, but it's still going strong. So there's a whole lot of stuff about the Susan Walsh. It's r/Unsolved Mysteries and the Susan Walsh mystery case. Now this happened, you can find it as a thing in New York City, but remember it happened in Nutley, New Jersey, where she was last seen. And you can look up anything on Susan Walsh. Now you know the story about Mercy Brown. Next week we'll talk about werewolves. I'm trying to find things, see, we're already at a half hour with this one. I don't like these videos to be too long, but I'm also trying to find, I've got all kinds of stuff from the 1700s in France. Like, I've got stories there, but I'm trying to find something a little more modern. Like we've got the Susan Walsh thing, and I don't want the modern thing to only be the Bray Road Beast. So we'll still talk about the Bray Road Beast, never fear, but I want it to be something else as well. So that'll be it for me. I hope the universe is treating you kindly. I hope things are well. And thank you, as always, for being here. And thank you, Haunted Ghost, for the recommendation. I hope this helps you in finding your real stories. It's just a primer, I know, but everybody likes a little bit of an appetizer, don't they? So let's see. Is the remote going to do me dirty today? That'll be it for me today. So bye-bye.